very happy to say that this time we're being joined by an old friend and colleague of mine, Paul Cheston, who for many years was the courts reporter at the Evening Standard. And I think it was in that capacity that we first met, Paul, because I was down covering some gruesome trial, I'm sure, at the Old Bailey, where I ran into you. And it turned out that we were at school together.
That's right. I was explaining to Victoria slightly earlier that we did work out that we had coincided at the great alma mater that is Kimbolton School, to which many years apart. And yes, we clearly made such an impression on each other that neither of us could remember each other. But the scenario played out so that I was the evil, wicked prefect trying to slap down the young, fresh-faced Ando of yes, not of the removed, but of the pre-prep.
Well, that was because I think at that time, when we used to have to do our homework, they'd put some poor hapless sixth former down to have to sort of keep an eye on all the obnoxious little squits who were just causing trouble.
Was that you?
Absolutely, it was me, yeah.
I thought you were you just pretending you were showing off about your past of crime when you were 7?
What past of crime? I mean, I think misbehaving. You
told me you peddled comics and stuff.
Oh, that was at a different school, a little bit later on.
That's after you got thrown out of Kimbolton.
Yes, well, yes, and I'm sure under the firm hand of the Kimbolton prefects, none of that nonsense would have been tolerated. Anyway, Paul, it's great to have you along.
Thank you.
I mean, so first of all, I mean, I was reading she left and retired. They gave you quite a send-off at the Old Bailey.
That was right. It was a huge surprise because I really just expected on the final day to shake a few hands and wander off into the night. But the Recorder of London, who I'd known when he was just a junior barrister, Nicholas Hilliard, put on this grand event, which is normally reserved for retiring judges, what they call a valediction in court, and I'm put up in the witness box, and the judges arraign across the one side of the court, and they say nice things about me. So it was a huge surprise and a very touching moment that someone from the Fourth Estate can would actually be recognised, other than just normally told to shut up and get back to the dungeon or the press room.
Absolutely. I mean, you and I have sat together in lots of trials at the Old Bailey, and how many times do you think you've fallen asleep?
Well, I may have retired, so I can actually be more honest than I would if I was thinking my editor was listening to this. It does happen occasionally, and particularly in the, shall we say, the post-lunch session, it is very easily done. I'm pleased to say that if I found myself nodding off and putting in some quality Zs, then I would manage to up and get myself out of court before the judge spotted me. But I do remember an occasion where a more senior colleague of mine was not only asleep but snoring, and he was prodded with a judge looking at him. He was prodded by an usher and woke up with a big start.
They've got to work on their technique.
That's right. That's not the done thing. Remember.
But the truth is, I mean, and you mentioned this of the post-luncheon session, say between sort of 2 and sort of 3:15. Yeah. And I often wonder, if you're a barrister, is that the time to either introduce the evidence you don't want the jury to listen to, introduce the evidence you do?
Well, the clever barristers time that period, as you say, between 2 and 4 or 4:15 to really hit, if they're cross-examining the defendant, say, or a key witness, to actually really hit them with the hard stuff. So you would allow the full set of security that during the morning, say you're starting at 10 o'clock and you are cross-examining for 3 hours or so, then you have lunch, then you come back, then another hour or so, and then suddenly towards the end, when the witness or the defendant is at his or her weakest moment, should we say, or boredom has set in, that's when you absolutely hit them with the old sledgehammer and expect to spark a reaction that they wouldn't have out of sheer tiredness.
Paul, tell us about 23 years as the Evening Standard's What was your job title there?
It was they called me the court's correspondent, not to be confused with the court correspondent, who would be St James's Palace or the Court of St James, I should say, rather than just a humble hack taking a note. And
well, I don't know. That's a great run, because we're not so lucky to be able to cover so much court anymore.
Well, that is true, and that I was very lucky to have, shall we say, a golden period of crime, and
sounds like it.
And not just at the Old Bailey or Crown Courts, but also in the civil courts, so that it was also a golden age of libel. We had some fantastic runs down at the High Court in front of the jury, which were court cases right out of the top drawer. The most fantastic dramas you could expect, like the likes of Geoffrey Archer and the great Neil Hamilton with the brown envelopes and taking bungs and this and that. And forever. They were wonderful days. And yes, I do feel sad today to see that courts have been downgraded, that there's a lesser stream through. There are less court reporters, and that is a sad, I think, decline, because what happens in Her Majesty's Court is not only of prime importance to everybody, and should be, but it's also cracking everyday human drama.
Well, we know of you from, you've come up on the podcast, I mean, because of Priscilla Coleman.
Yes.
And you've co-written a book, is that right?
That's right. In 2010, we did a first book together of her drawings. And as you rightly point out, this is remember that when she appeared on your podcast a while back, that she was the ITN court artist.
And they're still going strong.
Absolutely, yes.
So at least that's happening.
Yes. Well, I mean, and they will continue to do so until the TV cameras are allowed into court to ruin everything.
So, Paul, I've got to ask you, we've got Priscilla,
yes.
who does the ITN pictures, and I mean, we've had her on. I love it a bit. And I mean, but you always look at her drawings and you think she's lifted herself off her feet because she colours in so hard, doesn't she? Really bright, colourful stuff. And then you've got Julia, who does the stuff for the BBC, and it's much more sort of nuanced, sort of, she kind of just draws a face and maybe a bit of torso and just kind of that's it. And it's a completely different style to Priscilla. So when you were looking at doing the book or working with Priscilla, I mean, did you sort of think we should do pictures from all the different artists, or was that was always out of the question because they never share the same page?
Well, there has been a certain rivalry between the girls, and they're always ladies for some reason. Priscilla and Julia, as you mentioned, the two, and also Elizabeth Cook for Sky and one or two others. But it was the idea of the book was Priscilla's idea. So, I let her dictate. It's her book, really. It's her pictures.
Yeah.
People buy it because of the pictures, not about what I wrote to go with the pictures. And I let her dictate matters. And hopefully we will have another one out later this year.
But I think it was always the case that Priscilla probably made a lot more selling pictures to barristers and judges than she ever made out of the TV companies.
ITN didn't have the deepest pockets, but as I did point out a number of times, never underestimate the vanity of barristers and judges. They do like a nice picture of themselves, and I remember at very early on when at the Jamie Bulger trial up in Preston, and Priscilla was there and we were there, and it was about November, December, and Priscilla's agent at that time, a lovely Jackie, arrived, and just before lunchtime, and the court stopped at 1 o'clock, and as I was going out, she was going the opposite way down towards the barrister's bench, and she was saying, yes, Mr. Henriquez prosecuting. Now, what can we do for you? Some 6x4s or some big Christmas is coming.
We're in the wrong business.
That's right. Yeah. Book early, book often.
I wanted to ask you about your book about the babes in the wood, and I wanted to ask you firstly what your motivation was behind writing a book like that?
The Babes in the Wood case involving Russell Bishop, who murdered two little girls in 1986, and the huge issues that then ran for the next 30 years, was a huge story in Brighton. I live in Brighton, it's where I'm speaking to you from now, and we moved there in the early 80s. It was a huge story. In many ways, it was said to be bigger than the Brighton bombing, the 1984 attack on the Mrs. Thatcher and the cabinet in the Grand Hotel, because it was so obviously a Brightonian had done it. And it took them 6 months before or 3 months before they arrested Bishop. So it was a huge issue here in Brighton. What happened was that Bishop was arrested and put on trial the following year, 1987. He was acquitted after a multitude of disastrous occurrences for the prosecution and the police. And then 3 years later went on to attack another little girl in a similar way, who fortunately survived, but at great personal cost, and was then jailed. But 20 years later, he was due for release. And the great part of the book about the story of the Babes in the Wood murder is how the families of the two girl victims fought to reopen the case and to get justice against Bishop, who they always knew and blamed for the murders. At that time, in one of the golden threads of British justice was that you couldn't charge a man who had been acquitted of a crime. You couldn't recharge him at all. That was it on the same case and for the same murders. So Bishop, had he been released, as he was due for release, would have been able to walk the streets of Brighton yet again. But the family, particularly the family of Nicola Fellows, managed to lobby the then Home Secretary, David Blunkett, so successfully that he introduced the bill which overthrew what was known as double jeopardy, i.e. you couldn't be charged for the same crime twice, so that you could, if new and compelling evidence emerged. And this is a book of how the new compelling evidence emerged. And Russell Bishop was indeed, in 2018, put back on trial at the Old Bailey.
Paul, I mean, you mentioned double jeopardy there, and I can't remember the exact circumstance, but my recollection was that was also much talked about in relation to the murder of Stephen Lawrence as well, and subsequent proceedings for that. But that's actually put me in mind of something I did want to ask you, which is obviously, during our time, we have seen significant changes. Double jeopardy is one of them, which I suppose I never thought I'd see, but then here it is. And the other one, which I never ever thought I'd see, but which is now routine, is that juries can be told about previous convictions of a defendant. And I think that's made a huge difference to the feel of things, because wasn't it always a thrill when there was a guilty verdict of the jury would hear this massive litany of all the rest of the stuff that the defendants had done, and they'd be looking at each other thinking, oh my God, we made the right decision then.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ben. That's the three big changes in our time was double jeopardy, the right to silence, and as you said, past convictions. And it's true that we used to, try and pick out which members of the jury had fought hardest for the defendant, and they're the ones going. And all the other jurors turning around. We spent 3 days arguing over this, you idiot, and all that sort of stuff. It was staggering. But of course, how unfair it is if you're a juror, just an ordinary member of the public, and you sit in judgment in good faith without knowing a crucial element, you would have thought, looking back on it now, that this bloke had done it 5 times before. Yeah. For instance, that is, in our time, a huge change. And, I don't know anybody who'd say it's not a change for the better.
Can I ask you about how it was to cover that trial? I mean, it was just huge and emotive. And what was it like? What could you describe the atmosphere and some
Sorry,
of
the Babes in the Wood
moments?
one.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it was the first trial in Lewes, which was just up the road from Brighton, and was a huge occasion. And it was, as you say, the frisson, the atmosphere was absolutely electric in so much that not only the battle in the court case, but watching on one side was the two families of the murder victims, and on the other was the Bishop family, who he had 4 brothers, and his mother was extremely well known at the time because she bred dogs and exhibited at Crufts and what have you. And just this between the two sides. And obviously when the jury came back with the verdicts, which on the evidence presented was the right ones, because it had been such a disaster for the prosecution, that he had to be acquitted. And there was absolute bedlam. I have never seen anything like it. One of the Bishop brothers tried to dive into the dock to hug his Russell Bishop, and was immediately set upon by the prison officers. They were screaming and shouting. It looked almost as if Bishop's father was going to have a heart attack and his mother was screaming her head off. It was absolutely bedlam, is no other word to describe it.
And what was his presence like in court?
He was, in the first trial, he was, unused to this. He didn't have a long record of crime or anything, and the estate, but he'd somehow, I'm sure, managed to convince himself that because he couldn't remember doing it, it must mean that he didn't do it. So he was very convincing in his air of, I'm innocent. This is an outrage. This is all wrong. I'm just a poor bloke who's been picked upon by the police. And it was, very hard to take for those, particularly of the families. And for us, we keep a straight face and report these things dead straight, obviously. But it was what we in the press knew at the time was that Bishop could be the only suspect.
And what about this partner of his who gave him an alibi?
That's right. This is a tricky thing, because Jenny Johnson, his common law wife at that time, mother of 3 of his children, was at the centre of this case. Because a crucial piece of evidence was a discarded sweatshirt that he'd thrown away on his return from the murders to his flat. The police had found that, but had managed to throw it, not to treat it with the respect of the most crucial piece of evidence in the most important murder hunt in Brighton's history. And this is what caused a lot of the problems. But yes, she originally identified, yes, of course, that's Russell's. By the time it came to court, she gave a different version, said she'd never seen it before. Now, 30 years further on, and with Bishop now convicted, the police have gone after Jenny Johnson, and she's been charged with perverting the course of justice and perjury. And her trial comes up at Lewes, is due to start in Lewes in a couple of weeks' time.
Lewes is a fantastic court, isn't it? Sorry, Paul. I was going to say, Lewes is a fantastic court. I've done the Roy Whiting, of course, Sarah Payne,
Roy Whiting,
yes. Billy Joe Jenkins as well, Sean Jenkins. And it's an incredible courtroom. It's a real old-fashioned assizes, isn't it? It really has that atmosphere about it.
It is, yes, and you still have a red-robed judge that comes in for quarterly sessions with great fanfare in a huge, big stretch black old Rolls Royce, and comes up the steps, and everybody has to bow and scrape and what have you. It is wonderful. And Court 1, where all the Bishop cases and the Billy Joe Jenkins case, the Sean Jenkins case and the Roy Whiting case, is the most fantastic old-fashioned Palladian style. Upstairs public gallery, downstairs dock in the middle of the court. It was spruced up and restored, but restored in exactly the same way. And it is, as I was in court just this week there, and it's wonderfully nostalgic to go back there.
It's a fantastic courtroom. And it's just, the thing is, when you're sitting in there, and we've both covered court cases in there, and you're listening to the evidence of the judges there, and it's all going on, but
you do have a sense of the history that's gone on there before while you're there. And if you just have to take pause for thought, it really does hit you, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. It is so atmospheric. I mean, it's so many modern day courts are, functional, breeze block, brick.
Southwark for a start.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What did you say?
Southwark. It's an awful court, isn't it?
Oh, shocker. Yes. That's what Lewis is such a joy.
I mean,
Yes,
the court, just to go off on a brief tangent, when we did Southwark, the trials that I remember doing there were a lot of the celebrity ones, like
Yes.
Rolf Harris, the young woman, the singer who was supposedly framed by the fake sheikh from the News of the World. Oh, what was her name?
Constantine.
Yeah.
Yes, I know the one you mean.
Yeah.
But also, the Max Cliffords and all the celebrity.
But I mean, I really used to struggle to sometimes hear the evidence there because the rooms are so badly designed, you can barely hear. Whereas, you look at the older style courtrooms, and I don't know who designed them, but you could hear what was going on. They had the acoustics right, and that's really important.
I agree entirely. I mean, it seemed that in the old days they designed, or architects designed courtrooms as it should be, as a theatre. So the acoustics were perfect, and everybody could hear. But nowadays they seem to design courtrooms as an extension of the civil service or something, or some terrible Whitehall dusty back civil service office.
Are you trying to tell us that even the judge could hear? Surely not.
only if he's awake.
Yeah, exactly.
That's true.
When he's prodded with a stick.
Did you have a long stick, Paul?
Well, you leave that to the usher or to the judge's clerk.
That's why they look so stressed, maybe. What I wanted to ask you was about the trials that you've both worked on together. And do you remember each other from those?
Oh, yes.
The thing is, it's actually kind of difficult. I mean, obviously, Paul and I Paul actually used to work a lot harder than I did because the fact
We'll guess that anyway.
When you're working for ITN, as I was when I first met Paul, and then on to the BBC, the truth is you go down there just to take on one case, and as we all know, a typical TV report is probably barely 300 or 400 words, and that's it.
Yes.
And so I would sit there, I'd listen. Paul would come and go, and I'd sort of look up and notice him, and then I would see him feverishly taking excellent shorthand notes, whereas I was scratching stuff down in my sort of longhand because I learned shorthand when I started in journalism, but in broadcasting, you just didn't use it enough to keep it current. And you'll know, Paul, that if you don't keep up with shorthand, you lose it really, really quickly.
Yeah.
And so I would just be jotting down key passages or particular exchanges that I would focus on later on in my 300-word report. But you were having to, first of all, probably cover 2, 3, or 4 trials sometimes, in any given day when there was lots of things going on and you were writing all the reports. They would do some of it, but you'd still be expected to sprinkle your stardust over the stuff the Evening Standard was putting in. But on top of that, obviously, a lead, front page lead in the Evening Standard would be maybe twice as much, maybe 3 times as much copy as I was generating. So you had to have all that stuff there in your notebook.
It's true. We had very different jobs, Ben, didn't we? Really, you did the broad brushstrokes to give your viewers. You might have whatever 20 seconds or something to camera. For a front page story and maybe 2 pages inside a spread or even 2 spreads, yes, I'd be doing 1,500 to 2,000 words, and also with the different editions. That when I first joined the Evening Standard, there were 5 editions. In fact, two went before court even started. So I was aiming for what they used to call late prices extra, which was the first issue, which would be at midday to come out at 2 o'clock. And then the city final and closing prices and what have you, which would then have a deadline of 2 o'clock and then again at 3:30. So that I had to keep updating as well. But you're right on the other matter that particularly at the Old Bailey, that I was expected to cover the 18 courts of the Old Bailey, and I was supposed to know what was happening in 18. And that in dull periods, in cases that you and I were doing, I'd have to pop out next door, or even downstairs or upstairs, or as you say, rewrite someone else's stuff.
When you used to pop out, it wasn't always just because you were worried about nodding off then.
It wasn't to go to the pub. No, I knew that's what you were thinking of it. Not always, anyway. But it was hard. It was a hard slog. But the best bit was, of course, that at 4:15 or 4:30, everything I'd done had gone, and I could either go to the pub or go home, or laugh at you lot who still had most of the rest of the day to work.
Absolutely, yeah, we were still on until sort of 6, 7, 10 o'clock at night.
That's right.
But, so the specific cases that I remember us working on together that I'm thinking about now, obviously, probably the biggest one was Levi Belfield.
Yes,
that's the one that I always think about.
Yes.
The other ones that I have memories of us sort of just chatting or nattering about them were the Soham murders, Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr, and also Barry George, Jill Danden.
Yes.
I don't know what your recollections of those ones are.
Well, these were three of the biggest cases, weren't they? And I mean, to this day, the Soham case, in terms of the public appetite and the amount of words that I had to shift every day. I mean, even in the second and third week, we were still doing a splash and maybe one or two spreads, which is a huge amount of copy for a trial that's been running for so long.
Yeah.
That was an enormous case. The Sean Jenkins case you mentioned, that started at Lewis. He won his appeal and then had two further trials at the Old Bailey. I don't remember if you remember the time when Jenkins himself was, the jury couldn't decide on whether he'd murdered his adopted daughter twice. So 3 strikes and that's it. And so the Crown dropped the case. But I don't know if you remember that as the jury had returned the second time, unable to reach a verdict, and Jenkins knew he would now then be cleared. The court was adjourned briefly. He went out into the passageway outside the court of the Old Bailey. Meanwhile, from the public gallery upstairs came 2 grieving aunts of the dead girl, and proceeded to lay into him. Absolutely smashed into him.
I don't remember that one.
And of course, the security staff at the Old Bailey was sort of taken by surprise and sort of, didn't actually jump in and stop him. So they had him on the ground and were laying into him.
Oh my goodness!
The assistant chief constable of Sussex suddenly realised you might have to do some coppering here for the first time. He waded in where everybody else was just watching. He waded in and picked up these 2 aunts, and pulled them back. So,
were their legs going like that?
Stop this. That's right. Yeah, exactly. They were still sort of throwing punches and this sort of stuff, and carted them off.
Well, I do remember going back to Lewis on the very first day of Sean Jenkins' very first trial, as he walked into court. Bill Jenkins, who was Billy Joe's real father, I think, lunged at him and had a go, didn't he?
Absolutely, that's right. Yes, and in front of all the photographers.
Yes.
So that was
box office. It really was.
That's right. It was a nice moment for them. But yes, I mean, very unusually, considering that he was facing a murder charge, Sean Jenkins was granted bail.
Yeah.
On the grounds that he'd go and live in North Wales, I think it is. Only the trial, but of course, when the trial started, he was back. Yeah, and so he managed to cop a few, didn't he, from that family?
He did.
he was a former deputy headmaster and a sort of fairly not scholarly, but a school teachery type.
Yeah.
Billy Joe's original family were East End hard nuts. So it was sort of an unequal struggle between the.
Yeah. There were 2 different worlds colliding, weren't they?
Absolutely, that's right. Yes, yes.
But out of all the big sensational trials, the ones that we haven't mentioned, Rose West or Jamie Bulger, you just mentioned briefly.
James Bulger is the.
What stands out to you from those big ones? Are there any particular moments?
Well, the 2 you mentioned are sort of infamous, really, in terms of the horror of what was being portrayed, and I was at each day of both of them. Bulger in Preston and Rose West in Winchester. And it's one of those things where people say, oh, how awful was this? Well, it was, what was being described was pretty awful. But in some ways, the press have an advantage, particularly a newspaper man who has to take it down. So I'd be writing the stuff down, hear it, go through, make notes, go out and file it on the phone as we did in those days, down the line, and someone put it in the paper, rather than taking in the breadth of what was actually being said at the time.
Did you ever experience a delay? Because Priscilla Coleman told us that sometimes she'd come away from a day's proceedings, and at the time she'd have her work hat on, and then she went out with the court artist girls one of the evenings, and they all were crying at some film which was sort of innocuous.
Oh, yes, that's right. They all went out to, I think, see the bridges of Madison County. And absolutely, which is a weepy anyway. And I remember, yes, I wasn't there, but yes, they were telling me that what the other cinema goers must have thought, I don't know, because they were absolutely flooded.
Would you ever experience that? And it was sort of strange, there was that delay, or how would you process that kind of, hearing that kind of thing?
Well, I think newspapermen, and I'm sure this goes for TV as well, and to a certain extent, have a sort of developed thick skin or protection that they put up. And it is a serious point you're raising here. And certainly I know that for the first time, the jury in the Rose West, which was the first time in trials in this country, were given counselling afterwards. And of course, none were offered to us because, we were too macho and silly about it not to accept it. But it's a way that you try and deal with it. And I remember talking of the Rose West thing at the committal, not at the trial, but at the committal, which was done in an old-fashioned way. So all the evidence was presented at committal, which lasted for the best part of 2 weeks in a place called Dursley in Gloucestershire. And we were taking down the evidence which was being read of Anne-Marie, one of Fred and Rose's daughters. And it was shocking. I won't go into it, but it was, what was being done to her was absolutely shocking. And because we couldn't report at the time, so it was just a matter of taking notes, that had a bigger impact. And I remember it was February, and we were in an annex, which was part of a school, a junior school. So we were sitting on tiny chairs and what have you. But when that part of the evidence finished, the judge said, right, I think we better have a break here. And I remember going out into the school playground, and there was absolute silence from all of us. And, we were the Fleet Street's toughest crime reporters, allegedly. And people just walked around. I remember you could see your breath because of the coldness in the air, and nobody said a word. And then after about 2 minutes, Simon Hughes, a mate on the Sun, made a joke about it, and it wasn't a very good joke, but it was, either way, that's what cut the ice, and then people just got on with it. But that was stunning in its impact on me and on all of us at that time. And 10 minutes later, we went back in and we started all over again. But it's you work your own ways of having to deal with it, put it that way.
And
I think that's a really good point there. Sorry, Victoria.
Yeah, go on.
Because what you pointed out there, Paul, was that normally, I think, when you're in court reporting and you are reporting because it's an active trial, the stuff comes in, you filter it, you rearrange it, you turn it into chunks, and then it goes out. But what you were saying there was it was different because it was an old-style hearing.
Yes.
You were hearing the evidence. It was not reportable at that stage because this is a pre-trial. And so you were actually having to internalize it and process it. And I think perhaps that's where the difference was. You weren't able to sort of just get it out again. It was staying inside and festering.
That's right. Yeah, that was, yes, which you put your finger on and termed it much more eloquently than I did. That you're right. It lingered with you because we didn't have that quick turnaround. And then once you filed it and gone down the line, then you're on to something else. No, this was when you were still thinking about it. And fun enough, I thought, my God, it's going to be terrible when Anne-Marie gives evidence in person, she will go into the witness box at Winchester and describe all this, what happened to her in person. And this is going to be way worse than what we had then. And when she came round to do that at Winchester at the trial, when we could report it, from, and we were back into the mode of write it down, rush out, get it done, and it just went right over our heads. It didn't make any impact at all.
Can I ask you about James Bulger and about that trial, how it was actually done, and how the evidence was given, and also about your sort of on the same point as we've just been discussing, what you kind of came away from that with? Yeah,
that was some. Again, it caused a huge kerfuffle at the time. The fact you are putting two 10-year-olds, as they were, 11 when they came to trial, but 10 when they committed the murders, on trial in big boys' court in the full majesty of the law. I mean, very few other countries do this. Their age of not of consent, but of criminal responsibility, is that much higher, and other countries were just astonished that we should that Britain should do it in this way. At the time, I thought it was the right way to do it. But yes, the tragic elements of this was not so much what the kids did, which was fairly well known at that time. It was the reaction of witnesses who had seen them walking from Bootle Centre to the murder scene, which was some miles, and two kids with a little toddler, and blaming themselves for not intervening. That was a tragic thing to see, these poor people blaming themselves, for no reason. But the obvious, if you saw two 10-year-olds with a 2-year-old, you would think they're all part of the same family. And the last thing you would think that this is an abduction taking place. That was the biggest impact, I thought, on that Bulger trial.
Yeah, fascinating. Talking of sort of impacts and stuff, I mean, any trials that you can think of now where because when you were talking about how you felt that was the best way to handle that case, I think what that made me think, just briefly, that actually all of the court reporting I've done has made me think that, broadly speaking, our criminal justice system is reasonably fair and generally gets the right result. It's not perfect, of course it isn't, but I think in general, if you take away all the theatre and all the rest of it, at the heart of it, I think most of the time justice does actually get done. But I'm just curious as to whether any areas, Paul, where you think, first of all, justice doesn't get done, or where there have been, there are people who you think are in jail who shouldn't be.
That's a good point. I'm with you with that, Ben, pretty much. I think, it is in an imperfect world. The justice system we have is as good as any. And certainly I don't know of any other place that does it better, put it that way. There are lots of problems, I think, mostly with the length of time it takes. It shouldn't really take 12 months and often much, much longer to go from a crime committed, even with a quick arrest, before it appears in court. And of course, now with COVID, all those times will be elongated. I think that's the biggest bugbear with that. But to turn to your other point about, I think that, like you, that the success of it is that I can't think of many cases now, not as opposed to then, of serious miscarriages of justice. In the 70s, there was a whole host of them, and the 80s, with the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6 and the Bridgewater 3 and many others. But this, I think some of these things have long since been ironed out, and I would be very surprised if there is a major systemic miscarriage of justice at the moment. Having said that, there has been one or two that I thought, well, I'm sure he did it, but was there enough for the jury to convict when they did? One of which was the Lynn Russell case of the little girl of the
Michael Stone.
We've covered that on the podcast.
Honestly, Paul, you're right. I totally feel that there is a lot of there that I'm not happy about at all around the evidence from inside the prison with the word of one lag against another sort of thing.
And the fact that the crucial evidence has now been lost. And yes, I certainly think that Britain is a safer place because Michael Stone is locked up. But I certainly don't think that it was an entirely safe conviction. And of course, it went twice, two trials. Yeah, you know. So, and like you, the biggest issue I have is old lags giving evidence against each other, you know, and none of that rang true at all.
Yeah, it did. It really sat very, very badly with me, I have to say. But it's difficult because he was convicted. Well, he did get a retrial.
Yes.
And he was convicted again. So
yes,
you know, there was a sort of a check in there, if you like, a check in the system.
That's right. I mean, and he got the retrial on the basis that the some of the old lags were too dodgy for words.
Yeah. Well, didn't one of them, like the day after the first conviction, go in the Daily Mirror and say, "Oh well, I just made it all up" or something? And that's my recollection.
That's right. It was Barry Thompson, I think his name was, and my old friend Adrian Shaw took the call and went out to see him, and was right from as soon as he sat down with him, he knew that he was definitely the man who was saying what he was saying, and that he had a totally convincing story.
Yeah.
I just want to take you back to the. I asked quite an obtuse question about Jamie Bulger and what you were left with from the trial. I just want to sort of go back because you've sat in the same. This is what I find fascinating about court reporting. One of the elements is that you sit there with these people, and this is partly what our podcast is about. A lot of true crime fans, I don't know whether you have, they carry a stigma maybe, but they're looking for the reason. And I wonder what you would say those two little boys, those two children, or Russell Bishop, for example, what do you conclude that they are wrong uns? What do you conclude from that?
It's very tough, and of course every case turns on its own evidence. But yes, there are certain categories, those opportunist issues, those who have painted themselves into a corner and murder is the only way out of it. And obviously the huge motivation of sexual urges, which sort of covers each one of those things. On the Bulger thing, I'm not convinced the born evil stuff and what have you, and at all. I thought that they were just scally kids who got themselves into a situation. They lured the child away as an amusement to themselves, but after walking for 2 miles or whatever, he then became a nuisance. He said, how on earth did they then carry out this really savage murder when they could just let him, wander around on his own? Who knows? It's very difficult to get inside the minds of a 10-year-old. What has damaged my faith in that in so much is that the decision, which is, I think widely probably right, was to release them when they were 18, having just before their 18th birthday, i.e. so they didn't have to go into Young Offenders Institute and be corrupted from that, having spent more than half their life, roughly half their life up till then in care. Was that one, of course, has gone off the rails again and is not adapted and has child porn issues and whatever. And I don't really know what to make of that, because information about it, because of his identity and all that sort of thing, is so limited that only, I should think, a handful of child psychiatrists know the details of what happened in that. So the Bulger thing will run and run and run, and obviously the family will never give up, and Denise in particular will never forgive them and will go to the ends of the earth in the hope that somehow they come to a grisly end.
Did you ever speak to her?
She was sort of protected at the time, but yes, at the end we got a chance. But throughout that trial, she had a twisted face. And again, this is not any blame attached. Imagine, you're the mother of a 2-year-old in these circumstances. It was twisted with agonized expressions of trying, presumably, to come to terms with, these are the 2 kids what done it. And I'm sitting 10 yards, less than 5 yards away from them. In a couple of paces, I could actually, get that close. So I'm not here to judge, but it is, I still, and there was another program on TV a short while ago about it, and she is still, really bitter and torn up inside. It's
one of the cases I avoid completely.
Really?
I mean, it's interesting, and to hear from you is different. But if I have a choice of going to watch, and I'll watch all the kind of gory stuff and everything, but it's just that one. It's
Really? Yes.
She is a formidable woman.
Oh, indeed.
To hear her talk now,
Yes.
but she said that part of that process was having other children.
Yes.
And that was really important.
Thank goodness for that, because otherwise I think she may not even be with us if it hadn't been for that. She was so, her life was so wrecked. I've nothing but the greatest sympathy for her. It's horrible.
Well, as you say, it is a sort of stage in court, and people are they're playing out their lives in front of, and as you've mentioned, all the crime families and the families, the notorious families. It's just really, you really see the highs and lows of humanity, I suppose.
That's true. It's an insight into a completely different world that we're lucky enough, all three of us, to be in, reasonably settled, shall we say, stable environments, in which our lives are conducted in the mores of society. And this is so far outside that, and to have these people's lives and reconstructed in front of you, and their crimes gone over in extraordinary detail, it is a completely and utterly different world. It really is.
Ben, do you want to lift the mood, or have you got another sad question?
Paul, actually, I will lift the mood by saying that I think we had a conversation the other day on the phone, Paul and I. And I think you said, Paul, that you are kind of coming back off the subs bench, and you're going to be back in court sometime soon, are you?
You've answered my next question.
Again,
oh well, yes, that I was in court for the legal argument on the Jennifer Johnson case, which we were discussing earlier on the Russell Bishop thing. And when that starts, I will be back there with no book in hand, as I was at the Bailey in 2018, which was nice to be back on the old patch. And also it's a great relief to be able to make notes without having to think of an intro to file it and how to get this over in time for the edition.
Do you sneak back into court when you don't have jobs on?
No, I wouldn't say I'm tempted, but COVID's taken over, I can't anyway, but it's no, I'm pleased to say that I haven't had any great longing or hunger pangs or anything like that.
Nor have I, actually. I haven't been back once.
No. Well, I think I would, but I don't. I mean, obviously now, but
yeah, I mean, COVID makes it all different.
I bet if we did, we'd love it.
Yeah, I think I'd find it fascinating going back and just being able to observe it without having to, as you said, Paul, worry about introductions. What's the best piece? What am I going to? What pictures have I got so I can cover that part of the story? Who's done the drawings? Is it Priscilla or Julia?
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. I think, yeah. And Paul, you've been fantastic and really great to have you on, and lovely to catch up with you as well. I mean, maybe in 6 months we can do this again, because it'd be good fun to hear about your ongoing stuff. And the thing is, we've got so many cases we could talk about and pick up on, and there is lots of serious stuff. We've talked a lot about serious stuff today, but there is also some quite amusing stuff. Like I always chuckle when you get witnesses or defendants who think they're cleverer than the barristers.
Oh yes,
who come unstuck and all that kind of stuff.
Our favourite are the high voices. We like the
Levi
guys,
high
the
voice.
terrible guys.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Little voices.
That's right. It's rather like an early David Beckham before he got voice trained.
That's right. Yeah.
We can't actually mention Levi Belfield without talking about the voice now.
No, we can't. It's a bit of a thing. Yeah.
That shows what we talk about.
Yeah. Well, we had Colin Sutton on, and Colin Sutton was
isn't he wonderful?
He's
Magnificent.
fascinating guy. Yeah.
Top man.
Anyway, Paul, it's great to have you, and thanks for turning up in your living room or wherever you are.
When Ben
joining
didn't.
us. And we'll catch up soon. And yeah,
I'd be delighted to speak again at any time, and it's been great fun at this end as well. I promise you.
Oh,
Fantastic.
thank you for joining us. Thank you
Thanks,
so
Paul.
much. I'll give you a little link when it's
Sure,
when it's
up
out.
and running. That'll be great.
Okay.
Okay then.
Thank you very much. Lovely to meet you.
See you then. Bye bye now.
Bye.
Bye.